Hello, and welcome to the show Beyond the Journal, where we will discuss social media, digital education, and current controversies in cancer and medicine, and there are a few. I'm Dr. Jack West, Associate Clinical Professor in Medical Oncology at the City of Hope Cancer Center in the Los Angeles area. I'm joined today by my co-host, Dr. Charu Aggaral, Leslie M. Heisler, Associate Professor of Lung Cancer Excellence at the University of Pennsylvania's Abramson Cancer Center in Philadelphia. Hi, Charu.
Hi, Jack. Today we are pleased to welcome Dr. Pamela Kunz, who is the director of the Center for GI Cancers at Yale. And she also serves in the role of Vice Chief of DEI for Medical Oncology at Yale University. Welcome, Pam.
Thank you so much. Pleasure to join.
Great.
First off, we'd just like to get to know you a little bit more. We know you're a very established GI medical oncologist, but tell us a little bit more about the roles you serve at Yale.
Sure, happy to. So I am relatively new at Yale. I joined mid-pandemic in July of 2020, and with the goal of really helping to build a comprehensive GI cancer program for our network. So as the director of the Center for GI Cancers, I oversee a program that is in the beginnings, but over MedOnc, RadOnc, SurgOnc for our network, which we have many sites outside of our main campus throughout the state of Connecticut. And so that's been really exciting. I also serve as the director for GI medical oncology, so a smaller portion of that. And that encompasses research, patient care, and education. And I have lots of team members, so it's not something I can do alone. And then I've recently been appointed as the Vice Chief for Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion for the section of medical oncology. This is an initiative being led by our Department of Medicine chair and one of the deputy chairs. And so our chair is Dr. Gary Desir, and one of his deputy chairs is Dr. Inhinia Janau. And every division in the Department of Medicine will have a vice chief, and this is actually just getting kicked off, but I'm really excited. And this will really help focus some efforts around DEI in our department.
Excellent. You moved and changed positions kind of mid-pandemic, and the pandemic probably changed everything in a lot of ways. And obviously, we're going into ASCO, which is going to be for the second year a virtual event. I would imagine that even once we can go back to convening in the same places, virtual meetings like this will have a bigger role than they did. And we know we can do it. And it's not exactly the same as being there, but you don't have to get on a plane to get everyone in the same place and have at least some version of the experience. But it also has made it maybe possible for people to work from different places, from home, etc. I know that you spend a lot of time thinking about and working on opportunities for women in medicine. Do you know of data, or can you speak to just thoughts on how the pandemic, with a lot of people working from home, kids not going to school, how has that affected women in medicine in general, and particularly maybe academic oncology? And is this potentially an opportunity or a big setback in the scheme of things?
Those are great questions, Jack. I think that it's probably a little bit both a challenge and an opportunity. I think that certainly many of us women in oncology, women in medicine, I think face some real challenges throughout the pandemic of trying to juggle. I have 3 sons. They are 15, 12, and 9 in 3 different schools. And we moved and had, I don't know how many times our sort of school schedule changed throughout the year. We are fortunate to have some additional kind of childcare support, but I think that it was complicated. And I was also working from home and trying to juggle a new job. And so I think many women faced having to juggle this. Suddenly the worlds collided of work and home. And I think that burden fell in large part on many women. And I think we've seen women leaving medicine because of that. I think women leaving the workforce in general. And I think I think that will be a challenge that's ongoing. I think that some of the innovations that have been made through the pandemic around virtual meetings and, whether they be professional society meetings or even just meetings for your own institution, I think have actually allowed for some increased flexibility. I was talking to my division chief the other day. I think none of us are going to want a 7 a.m. in-person meeting anymore. And I think that, and also the downtime in my life's been simplified in terms of travel. And I think that I've been able to make it to more of my kids' baseball games now that they're actually happening. And so I think it's a balance. I think we need to really recognize and look at how can we help provide better childcare. And that's been a real highlight, I think, of the pandemic and something that's important for both men and women who are working. But I think that maintaining some of the virtual meetings will be important.
Yeah, I think you frame it beautifully. There are opportunities and there are challenges, right? I think at the beginning of this pandemic, it was sort of like no questions asked, please stay home, don't come in if you don't have to. But now with many of us, planning for quote unquote re-entry, it's not like we left, but, re-entry and being more on site and being in person. I and others worry, I think we all worry that there may be a bias, especially towards women who, as you said beautifully, I think there were a lot of opportunities that we realized that we gained during the pandemic that, we were able to make it to more dinners, or, more games or more social events in whichever form they occurred. But what is, I guess, your plan or your institution's plan for re-entry? And do you think there can be ways to maintain these hybrid meetings and minimize bias?
All good questions. I think we're all figuring this out. I know that, as we enter the summer months, I know that my division chief has announced he's going to pilot no meetings before 8 and none after 5. And I think that that's both virtual and in person. So I think we'll see if that's something that will stand. Certainly individuals can have meetings at other times, but in terms of division-sponsored meetings, I think that personally, I'm really trying hard to also be better about drawing a line in the sand. I don't know about you guys, but I think the Zoom meetings kind of created this we could always be in a meeting during the pandemic. And I found that really stressful. These just constant meetings, it somehow was easier to call a Zoom meeting than an in-person meeting. So I think we need to dial that back some. And I'm learning from colleagues who are saying they're only going to set 25-minute meetings for a 30-minute block or 45-minute meetings for an hour block, of really trying to create some breaks. And not every meeting needs to be a Zoom. It could still be a quick phone call. So I think we all have to figure out, it's a work in progress. I don't know that our institution or division has figured it out yet, but I think we're starting to have some conversations. I'd welcome if you guys have ideas.
Well, I actually love the idea of not having to run from one building to another for meetings. I remember those days not very fondly. Sorry, Jack, you were saying something.
Yeah, it was just a few things. One, I do think that having 25 minutes with a 5-minute off or 45 minutes in an hour slot is a great thing. But again, I mean, even aside from the pandemic, many of us, I don't know how it is at Yale, but obviously Charu is talking about going from building to building. I mean, just physically going from one meeting space to another, more and more of us are working out of networks, and some of the other people in the network are not on the same campus. And so it is not trivial, even aside from the infectious risk, to have people all having to converge in the same place when you can have that kind of experience, some semblance of it online. And but I do wonder how much women in particular, and secondarily humans, people of any gender or sex, might be concerned about having the flexibility to work from anywhere, but being concerned that they're going to be on a different trajectory. And this is something that I think many women in particular have been vocal, increasingly appropriately vocal about, focusing even somewhat on childcare and not being completely all in on professional commitments all the time, and feeling like that puts you on a lower trajectory. And so I do wonder how the opportunity is really great to not have unnecessary burdens of being in one place all the time, but that we need to go to some effort to ensure that people aren't punished for that.
Yeah, I completely agree with you. I actually do think that the virtual opportunities for women are really important to maintain. So I'll give, a few examples. So advisory boards and CME events, I think if they're not otherwise attached to a professional society meeting that I'd be attending, I'm hard pressed to say yes to those given my other commitments at home. And I think that those are really important opportunities for women to have a seat at the table. And I think that if some of those can be maintained virtually, I think that will be really important.
So let's switch tracks a little bit and talk about your role and, your involvement with women in oncology. I know you're on the hematology oncology or HemOnc women's board. We're on the Pure Perspective board together. So tell me about your involvement and your vision for that.
So this has been really an evolution, and I think really came out of personal experiences with my departure from Stanford and experiences of mine with gender discrimination and harassment. And I think that in the beginning, I was sort of a reluctant spokesperson for this particular topic. And a lot of, the press that came out around my departure at Stanford was kind of by accident. And then I was at a place where I had a job in hand, and we can certainly talk about this, but I think I did not have to fear as much risk of retaliation because of that. So I actually really felt that I had an opportunity and an obligation to speak out. And, now reflecting back on the last year, it's in and of itself has been incredibly empowering. And it's also been a way for me to put some frustrations into a really productive way. So I was very deliberate in seeking out opportunities through ASCO. So I pitched a gender disparities session, which is going to be held at this year's ASCO. It was supposed to be last year, but it will be this year. And also, I'm excited that ASCO's been really supportive of this as a topic. And there are some great abstracts that will be presented around gender disparities, workplace disparities, sexual harassment. I sought out opportunities at my own institution. So that's has led to my opportunity to serve as the vice chief for DEI, and have started speaking about my experience publicly and about the collective experience of women in medicine and women in oncology. And I'll give you an example, a teaser of hopefully a manuscript that's coming out soon. But I had an experience where I was invited to participate in an advisory board, and I'm now I ask about composition of advisory boards and who is chairing, and it ultimately what I found out that it was going to be mostly men. I legitimately had a conflict and couldn't participate, but it led me to contact and reach out to the leaders of that company. And it's now, fast forward, it's led to what will hopefully be a perspective piece. And we've pulled together a lot of industry leaders to talk about advisory board composition and key opinion leader mapping and what that means and how women are often excluded and why. So I think that we all, whether it's academia or industry or other kind of companies that we interact with, all have an obligation to try to promote gender equity.
Fantastic.
I want to ask about something that has really just come out and upended some of the academic oncology world. And that's an article that came out in the Cancer Letter, an investigative journalism piece that's very extensive about Dr. Axel Grothe, and who's historically been a respected, influential member of the GI oncology world in particular, and issues with him having inappropriate sexual relationship with a mentee and some professional colleagues, and obviously this is a terrible problem and a shameful issue, not just personally, but for the institutions involved, that in terms of how people respond to this, and I'd like to get some of your take now. I'll mention you're quoted in the article, but people have just been reverberating over this, and questions of how common is this? I think you'd like to think this is extremely isolated, but as we learn a little more, it's not as isolated as we'd like it to be. And then maybe you can comment, because you're in a position of leadership, on what systemic failures there have to be and what we're going to do about all of this.
Yeah, thanks, Jack. I mean, such a huge topic. And I will say your word of reverberating is perfect. I mean, I haven't been able to stop thinking about this since it came out a few days ago. And I think many of my colleagues, both men and women, I think were shocked. And I was quoted as talking about sexual harassment in general. I did not know the details prior to the article coming out. I think that this is a much larger problem than a single person. I think that this is really a systemic issue. And I think that the field of medicine, unfortunately, given its strong hierarchy, really lends to these power differentials and really sexual harassment of all types, whether it's sexual coercion or gender harassment, really is about power. And I think that sadly, a field that has these hierarchies really, unfortunately, enables that dynamic. And I think that one of the things that I was quoted as in talking about was around how many of these institutions tend to protect the brand rather than the individual.
Right.
And I think that this is something that I think we as a broader community need to figure out how to address. And I think it's being comfortable speaking up. It's knowing who your allies are and knowing who the resources are at your institution. I think that's a really, honestly, in my personal experience, was really hard for me to figure out when I was struggling with, my own issues with gender harassment. So I think we need to figure out better systems to track and measure harassment. This is something that's actually, for folks following the story on Twitter, has been brought up a number of times, like how can we create national systems for tracking and measuring harassment in medicine? We need better systems of accountability. And so meaning, if someone is found to be a harasser, what are the repercussions of that, rather than them going on to another institution and getting a better position? And I think that there's a long track record of that in medicine also. So I think but to kind of end with some hope, and I think we talk about this some at the gender disparity session at ASCO, and I think that we need to focus on solutions. And I think actually ASCO is in a really powerful place, and there's an opportunity, hopefully within our own community, to think about solutions specifically around the tracking piece, tracking metrics, and accountability.
Well, I think
you said this was a pretty big story. I think just dissecting the layers, I think there was this, just like you, I think I was initially shocked. And, I happened to share this with one of my friends, with one of my close friends, who's actually not in medicine. She's, a designer. And, her first comment to me was, well, why are you shocked? This happens in every industry. And, as the story developed over the weekend, over social media, I don't know, I was still shocked. And I think maybe because in academia, we think of mentor-mentee relationship as being very sacred. And, we think about really supporting our colleagues and really nurturing the next generation. But then I got a little bit more surprised as more and more women started to share that this happens to them routinely, that this has happened to them often by individuals in a position of power, and how, they are at a place where they can miss out on opportunities, be it for academic advancement or, getting grants or getting funding or getting into other leadership positions. And I think what really floored me was that so many of these issues went on for several years and went on from one institution to the other. Any thoughts about that? If there were rumblings in the GI field, if this happens again, what steps can be taken, 3 years before the story or investigative piece comes out?
Yeah. Well, I'll comment and then I'll try to answer your question. So I'd say, as to add another comment around how widespread this problem is, in Dr. Ishwarya Subbaiah's abstract coming up, this is public information, so it's already in the abstract, but the respondents of a survey on which this abstract was based, 70% of female respondents reported some form of sexual harassment in medical oncology. So, and this was a mix of trainees, mostly faculty. But I think that indicates the problem is incredibly widespread. Now, that describes a huge range of forms of sexual harassment, from coercion to microaggressions. But I think that, my hope is that we start to create a community where we normalize talking about this. Like, we just need to all have this be part of our regular conversation. It can't be hush-hush. I think we need to create forums where it's safe to talk about, both at our own institutions, but also broadly as a profession. And but this, I think what has been paralyzing is this sense of real fear of retaliation for both men and women. And that's tricky. I mean, I'm also still processing all of this with you kind of live as we talk about it. It's, I don't know how we fix that. And it's tricky.
Yeah, I hearing us talk about this. I mean, Charu, you said you and your friend were discussing how, we see this. And I mean, this isn't that different from the disturbing, explosion of what we learn about abuse in the Catholic Church of, and people are allowed, priests are allowed to get relocated and continue this kind of thing in politics, in the church, in, of course, the entertainment industry with Harvey Weinstein. I mean, these are just incredible power structures. And I think one of the things that really abets this in medicine is that we're pleasers. We're all people who you have to do what you're expected to do to succeed in medicine. You have to get good grades and be there and do what you're told to do for years and years on end.
Right.
People don't want to uproot. I mean, it's not an easy place to be a vocal objector to the status quo, because there is a really rigid, hyper-regulated system that rewards people who work within the system. And I think that's a real problem. I'll just say that in the Twitter discussion, one thing that that this does strike me is, people will. I did see one comment of, look, of course, I'm against what happened. I feel like I need to speak out against this, despite this potentially hurting me in my career. And I think that's in this forum where it's like, I don't think that's that risky, but it's something entirely different when you're making when you're making statements and complaints against somebody who is not already the subject of an investigative journal piece. And that's risk. But to me, the problem is you do need to make a choice between potentially trashing your career and protecting yourself. And I think that we really need to address that. It shouldn't be this horrible Sophie's choice between your career and, giving into these kind of coercions.
Yeah, it can't be. And I think it's about incentives. It's kind of, again, what the institution cares about. And I think we need to, figure out how to help the institutions realign their values.
I would imagine at some point we have to get to a point where it's like there's whistleblower protections, and every case, every allegation gets mandatorily investigated in some way that ensures that the people who bring this up are not going to be hobbled in their careers, by speaking out.
Yeah. Agree.
Yeah, I think so many revelations over the weekend. And I do think that there were a few points that were made that were very valid, I think, including, sort of a moratorium on funding, or, publicly acknowledging that, these institutions or, organizations did not take a stand or, let this happen. It's very easy to say. Obviously, it's very difficult to enforce in a stepwise algorithmic fashion. But I do think that this may be, a time to call for real change in the way we practice academic medicine. And, sure, there was another Twitter post saying we shouldn't be shocked anymore, but it's still, I think it's the first sort of real story of its kind in academic medicine, even though we've since realized that, yes, this goes on much more frequently than we would acknowledge. So I do think it's time for change. Talking about something different and fun. Mm-hmm. So you've been, really prominent on Twitter and really enjoying the social media space. Tell us how it started and what benefits have you reaped out of this?
Yes, so I think I was more of an observer on Twitter to begin with, and that predated my departure from Stanford. And I think when some of the press was coming out, I had a good friend who's active on Twitter advised me. She's like, you should try to control the narrative. And so I tweeted about my sort of reasons for leaving. And I think that was really, I also was in search of a community. I felt very alone when I was going through what I was experiencing at Stanford. And honestly, the Twitter community and kind of the virtual community provided incredible support. I think that I was able to really find and follow people that valued the things that I valued. And that's been just so uplifting at a time when I needed it. And then again, it was mid-pandemic, and that was just pre-pandemic. And then during the pandemic, being able to connect with people virtually has also been just wonderful. And it's opened my community to folks outside of GI oncology, both in terms of, broadly the world of oncology, but even academic medicine and others who value DEI and value collaboration and culture of respect. And so I think that for those of, listeners who are not on social media, I think you really can tailor, who you hear and who you see on these social media platforms. Now, that being said, there are definitely some downsides, and I've learned to not read some of the comments and just don't listen to that noise. But I think that for the most part, it's been incredibly positive and fun. So, I don't tweet all of it. I tweet a lot about GI oncology and DEI, but, you guys I know Mark Lewis, but we have a Twitter battle over our Fauci action figure / cardboard cutout. And, so there are some fun things about it too.
Yeah, I did see that, your RBG, and I'm sure that if they could, RBG and Fauci would probably interact more together, just like in your diorama. How's Yale doing telemedicine going forward? I know that Yale, like just about every place, come March of 2020, out of necessity, everyone was doing it. Where's the equilibrium settling out in terms of use, faculty perceptions of its utility, and longitudinal value going forward?
I think we're still figuring it out, but I think our in-person clinics are definitely getting busier. And I'm still seeing a number of patients by telehealth. And I think that as someone, the listeners may know, but my personal clinical focus is in neuroendocrine tumors, which is a rare disease space. So actually being able to provide some telehealth, we still have a reciprocity right now, the state of Connecticut with New York. So I can still see patients by telehealth in New York, and I still have my California medical license. So I can see some of my old patients in California, which has actually been really great for my transition. I suspect that telehealth is here to stay in some capacity. And I think that situations that I think are perfect for telehealth are some of the surveillance scan reviews, actually patients on hospice, to be able to see someone at home on hospice with their dog and extended family, I think has been really rewarding. Some of my new patient visits I still do by telehealth because it's a long conversation. They can still have more family members with them. And then we can schedule a prompt return visit if something's needed. So I think there are some patients that it works well and others not as well, but I think that some level of it will be here to stay.
Yeah, I think it's interesting that it's likely to be a tool, not right for everybody, but for certain situations, it is of value. I would envision it being a minority, but a steady minority of clinical activity, as long as the legal issues are upheld, that you can do that across some state lines, and people aren't paid significantly more for seeing patients live. I think we can't expect people to work at a financial penalty by telehealth, but it's a real value.
Pivoting back to virtual conferences, Pam, what do you think in the future will be the landscape around conferences? Do you think they'll be hybrid? Would there be as much attendance as there used to be? Over the weekend, I saw an ad for ASCO, and they were, that hallway from, to D&E. That whole, that walkway was completely flooded with people, and part of my COVID pandemic self sort of, had a little mini seizure. I was like, oh my God, so many people unmasked. I can't really imagine a future where 45,000 people congregate together in Chicago for a weekend. What do you think?
I think most conferences will have to be hybrid to some degree. I really think that attendees are going to demand that. And I think that it's for flexibility, perhaps for safety. I think we don't know how endemic COVID is going to be, moving forward. And I know I'm in the process of helping to plan the next, our North American Neuroendocrine Tumor Society meeting, which I think will be in person in Chicago next October. So that's a much smaller event than ASCO. But I think we're talking about making sure that it's hybrid, so that people that either can't come for whatever reason still have the ability to participate in the sessions. So I agree with you though, Charu. The idea of being with 40,000 people in Moscone gives me some palpitations.
Well, I think that it really not that different from telemedicine. I mean, people, once we've shown the proof of principle that you can do this, there are going to be people who are going to ask, why spend $3,000 flying to Chicago, from all over the world? It's the time, it's the money. We talked about women and childcare, but anybody with whatever obligations they have, whether it's childcare, elder care, other priorities, it would be nice to have a choice of, yes, I think, great, we should have a live event for people who can make it, provided it's safe, but other people will want the content, but not prioritize flying out for it if they can manage to stay at home. And so I think that just like you said, Pam, people will demand it. I think that's part of why I think, whether it's telemedicine or some hybrid for these events, we know it can be done. And for some people, the digital version is going to work well enough that people are going to prefer that in the long term.
Well, we look forward to meeting you in person at the next, whichever meeting there is. I mean, I think there is definitely value to networking and meeting people as well. Just like, telemedicine is great. In-person visits are also, sort of like that special factor. But thank you so much, Pam, for joining us today. You can find us on iTunes or wherever you find your podcast content. We hope that you will subscribe and send us comments and feedback to beyondthejournalshow@gmail.com. We thank Mark Lindsay and Talking Speaker for production and distribution support. See you in a couple of weeks with our next guest.
Thanks for
joining. Thank you.
Great.